Career, setting the context for our conversation, the rise of the far right in European politics right now as seen as an outcome of the elections that have taken place to the European Parliament. How is that reflective of what is going on in the rest of the world? What does it really mean? What are the real reasons for this? And what does it really mean for India at this stage as well? Let's put this in context with our expert panel joining us. Professor Madhav Das Nalapat is Director of Geopolitics and International Relations and UNESCO Peace Chair at Manipal University. And Suhasini Haidar, a diplomatic editor with The Hindu. Great to have you both with us this evening. Let me begin by asking you, Suhasini, if you look at the most significant, the most historic gains of the far right in the European Union, you'll see that it's really from the key member states. It's from France and Germany and Italy. What would you put this down to?
What you're seeing is essentially the far-right parties, as they're known in the spectrum, gaining in Germany, in France, Austria, as well as Italy. I would put that rider, though, that this is an increase in the right support, and I think a lot of it has come from France. But essentially, the center is still holding, as the EU President von der Leyen herself said, that the center is holding. The EPP, the main European Parliamentary Party, which is completely centrist, has actually gained 13 seats. But I think what is becoming a cause for concern for these countries that you mentioned, where like Germany, where the AfD, the Alternative for Deutschland, as well as in France, where the Rally Nationale has done very well, is they are worried about what this will mean for parliamentary elections. In fact, the French president, Emmanuel Macron, went as far as to then dissolve his own parliament and say, I'll have new elections, which will be held at the end of this month, to kind of force voters to decide at this point, are they voting right? And in a kind of almost a moment of political brinkmanship, that's what he's done. His own presidency is not in doubt, but it could be, it could be deeply embarrassing for him if they weren't to do well in those elections. So I think it's a kind of it's a shock reaction from many countries in Europe, where the right wing has done better than expected. You asked why. I think there are three main reasons. There's immigration, which is a major concern in all the European countries. There's protectionism of a sort. So economic protectionism is much more, businesses are voting really much more for the right. And I think the third is the Ukraine war and the anti-Russian sentiment.
So these three reasons, if they are the reasons why we are seeing this shift of the politics towards the far right in Europe, Dr. Nalapat, how do you view this on a very polarizing subject like immigration or even asylum seeking? It has a bearing for Indians as well, especially when you talk about immigration for Indians working in Europe. How do you see the rise of the right-wingers in Europe impact key policy decisions, especially on the account of immigration?
Well, Suhasini is absolutely right in pointing out these three factors. But the fact is, it's poetic justice. The EU was formed on the implicit premise of us versus them. We Europeans versus the others. And frankly, by the others, they really meant the global south. And the European Union was founded on this concept that Europeans are different from other people. And the European Union had very extensive controls on legal immigration. Now, even 30 years ago, when this whole European idea and the construct was being developed, it was pointed out that if you ban legal immigration in the way you have, you're basically going to create a situation of illegal immigration. And that's exactly what happened. After 2011, when the European countries and the United States intervened in Libya, intervened in Syria, intervened in these and other countries, you had a huge flood of people traveling to the European Union. It had been pointed out in 2011 itself that what you're calling about, the Arab Spring, what you're going to see, in fact, a Wahhabi winter. For some time that did take place, and there was a huge flood of illegal refugees. So the European Union was very negative towards legal refugees. I mean, legal, not refugees, but if I may say so, legal immigrants, people who could contribute professionally, people who would contribute higher taxes. They were very reticent to that. Indians, for example, and somebody from Chennai, a techie from Chennai or a techie from Bangalore
Yes.
was not welcome. Now, that frankly has caused, and the surge of illegal immigration is one reason,
Yes.
but very importantly, it's also the fact of the growing inequality that we are seeing in European society.
Right.
The rich are getting much richer. The poor, the middle class, are frankly finding it difficult to hold their own because of the high inflation caused by the sanctions imposed again by the EU during the Ukraine war. And the poor, frankly, are having a very tough time. Because so this is the problem. The rich are getting richer, and it's very easy for political parties to blame it all on the migrant.
Right. Indeed. So if that is going to be the way as far as right-wing policy is, Suhasini, when it comes to these key pointers that you have brought forth, when it comes to immigration or whether it comes to trade even, you did mention protectionism. This is a time that India is looking at boosting its exports. Will the rise of the far right actually help India's cause, or will it be a hindrance?
Well, to be fair, the way the European Union works, India does not just work with one country when it comes to EU trade. But remember that the EU is India's third largest trading partner. It is a very important trading partner. We're in the middle of what seems to be endless negotiations for a bilateral trade and investment agreement. So yes, over there, you may see certain protectionist moves or certain tariffs that can't be surmounted becoming an issue between India and the EU. On the other hand, one of the factors, and I mentioned immigration, I mentioned protectionism, one of the factors has really been, the pushback against environmental costs across Europe. The EU is, of course, in the developed world, and and their governments are really pushing hard costs on businesses, on consumers, for environmental reasons, to cut carbon emissions and that sort of thing. Maybe going too fast for the populations over there, and there's been a shift in the vote against that. That might, in some way, help India, which has always chafed, in a sense, at the EU's restrictions over imports from India on environmental reasons. So it's a little more nuanced and complex than it seems. I think at the end of the day, what you have to remember is that elections don't necessarily mean everything is just going to go one way. You might find in a future election a different outcome.
Right.
For the moment, what we're seeing, though, and Professor Nalapat referred to this pro-nationalist posture within the EU, which has always prided itself, in European countries, nationalism is seen as a very right-wing thing.
Yes.
So for an organization that's prided itself on its integration in Europe, I think that is the most worrying for the integrity of the EU.
Yes, but keeping these factors in mind, now there are these nuanced nature of activity that we see the European Parliament act on. And like Suhasini is pointing out, Mr. Nalapat, there would be, as far as India is concerned, this kind of bilateral business that would take place between various factions of Europe, member states. Which are the convergence areas, you think, and which are the areas in which India might see some kind of roadblocks because of the way the structure of the parliament now in Europe is going to be?
Frankly, I don't see very much of a roadblock. Taking on from what Suhasini was saying, the fact of the matter is that whether it's Germany and whether it's other countries, they are opening the door to skilled Indian immigration, especially Indian immigration related to tech and to advanced industries. Now, a lot of Indians are studying in Europe, and many of them have been incentivized to stay back in the countries in which they are studying because they have become professionally so skilled. So from that point of view, I don't see much of an impact on India. And of course, the second point is that in terms of ideology, India has also gone in a very nationalist direction. And it is not, if you look at, for example, Marine Le Pen, if you look at Giorgia Meloni has been extremely friendly to the government of India led by Prime Minister Modi. He has been made very welcome, on his visit to Italy. And I don't see that, any of the other individuals we're talking about will be different. Now, for example, Marine Le Pen, I don't think there'll be very much difference on that. Now, so far as the UK is concerned, it's very interesting because Nigel Farage, as Suhasini was saying, they're basically talking now, instead of European values, which they say don't exist, they're talking of French values, German values, English values, and Scottish values. And they're saying that we will protect them. Nigel Farage, for example, is likely to do immense damage to the Conservative Party in the coming elections because he's saying Conservative Party no longer represents you. It's too, implicitly what he's saying is too cosmopolitan. You need the British values to come back. And he does not mean British values in a racial sense. Farage, for example, has been very welcoming of immigration from the West Indies.
Correct.
Why? Because they speak English, they play cricket, etc., etc.
Yes,
but he is very unwelcoming of immigration from countries where the cultures are entirely different from that of Britain.
Right. So while we see this shift take place, Italy specifically you mentioned, and Suhasini, do weigh in on this because as far as Prime Minister Giorgia Meloni is concerned and her Brothers of Italy party, which has right-wing roots, they consolidate this time. They've held their position in the European Union. They've captured a quarter of the vote, in fact. Mr. Modi has spoken very warmly of India's bilateral relations with Italy. Do you see a stronger strategic partnership because both hold a more nationalist agenda to that extent?
Well, I'm not sure because, if you look at the Indian election results, they haven't exactly been a big push for hyper-nationalism. The fact that the one single majority party is now in a coalition government in India means that Prime Minister Modi will also have to be sensitive to the idea that this is not necessarily what the mandate was about. I think when it comes to dealing with Italy, actually the real issues with Italy were over if you remember in the past decade, were over the Marines who had been accused of killing Kerala fishermen, had been convicted, and it was about whether they would serve out their terms here or in Italy. Eventually, India went to the arbitration courts internationally and lost that case. After that, it took a few years to put the India-Italy relationship back on track. But since then, year on year, we've seen a growth. We've seen several visits by the prime ministers, including Prime Minister Meloni, who actually made 2 visits last year to India for the G20, as well as for the Raisina dialogue, a bilateral state visit, and then met with Prime Minister Modi on the sidelines of the COP. And the selfie they put out clearly showed a lot of bonhomie. This invitation to India for the G7, it's not the G7 itself, it's an outreach meeting to which 12 countries and all are invited other than the G7, is also significant because India has been invited, I think, 11 times to the G7 now. It's a member of the Global South. It's an important country for all of these G7 countries to engage with. And Prime Minister Modi himself, I think, is taking his 5th visit to the G7. It's certainly an acceptance and an understanding of India's position in the economic sphere, as well as in dealing with the current conflicts of the world. They are going to play quite a role in the conversations that we expect to see tomorrow in that one big block session, which will look at the Mediterranean. It'll look at food scarcities. It'll look at energy security, which basically is about the Russia-Ukraine conflict. So you will see the fact that India's voice is required and important in all of these issues really playing out. As far as the India-Italy bilateral goes, they have been working on a number of agreements, including, in fact, on the issue of migration and mobility agreement. They have been trying to improve their bilateral trade. Italy is one of India's biggest partners in Europe already. So in terms of bilaterals, and Italy was upgraded to India's strategic partner last year as well. In terms of the bilateral, you'll certainly see some strong statements coming out. Prime Minister Modi is expected to hold a bilateral meeting with Giorgia Meloni. He's also meeting with the other members of the G7 through the day, and then he flies out of Italy tomorrow night.
So, Mr. Modi, in that sense, out on his first overseas visit, after taking charge as Prime Minister for the third time. This is an important piece in terms of diplomacy, in terms of pushing trade ties. Professor Nalapat, do weigh in on this as far as Europe's need is concerned, to serve that kind of need as perhaps a bulwark, a geopolitical bulwark against China. And over the last 10 years, how Mr. Modi has tried to give more by way of trade and investment access to Europe. Is that likely to continue? Is he likely to leverage the position that India has today for Europe?
Look, the fact of the matter is that Prime Minister Modi is back for a third term.
Yes.
In democracies, the same individual coming back for a third term as Prime Minister is very rare. In India, it's happened under Jawaharlal Nehru and never after that. So that's the first point. So the Europeans, frankly, quite understand that, look, he has come back for a third term. And in Europe, that's pretty special. The second point is Prime Minister Modi has made it very clear he wants to make in India. It's not made by India. It's made in India. In other words, he's welcoming countries, especially from friendly countries. And from the beginning itself, as you know, Prime Minister Modi has focused on better relationship with the United States, better relationship with Western Europe. He has focused very much on that. And now he's focusing on Taiwan. For the first time, he's mentioned Taiwan in a tweet. It's never happened before. He has responded to a Taiwanese president who's totally disliked in China in a tweet. He has basically, gone back to the ancient Tibetan names. The Chinese have changed all the names to Chinese names, but the fact is the Tibetan names are the real names in Tibet. He has done all that. So quite frankly, all this is watched by Europeans. And if you look at the European leaders who are on the rise in the European Parliament, I don't think that they will be at all unhappy about what Prime Minister Modi is doing. So I do believe that the cooperation will be there. Very importantly, I'd like to say that Politico in the United States has described the G7 as a meeting of Meloni and 6 lame ducks, because all the other 6 leaders are in deep trouble with the electorate, judging by the way election trends are going. So I'd like to say one very clearly that, look, I don't think there'll be any problem at all. Even should, for example, Marine Le Pen come as the Prime Minister of France, which I must say I admire President Macron for the risk he has taken. And even, for example, should Keir Starmer, who was historically, the Labour Party, after all, was responsible for the creation of Pakistan, the partition of India.
Right.
So even Keir Starmer, I don't think any of them are unfriendly to India, because we are in Cold War 2.0.
Yes.
That's between China and the United States principally. We are off Cold War 1.0 between the Soviet Union and the US. And that's why we have got away very lightly, despite standing up for Russia, where the Ukraine conflict is concerned.
And on that topic, as far as Europe is concerned, on the import of oil from Russia, Suhasini, that was a pain point. How has India done diplomatically on that count when it comes to the Russia-Ukraine war? And in terms of the kind of outreach that Europe is doing towards India, in terms of diplomacy for India right now, how important really is Europe and to get them on their side? Considering that we have focused a whole lot when it comes to Modi's diplomacy, we have concentrated a lot on the South Asian neighborhood, haven't we?
Okay, so when it comes to energy ties with Russia, I think India has made it very clear to the European Union. If you remember, just after Russia's invasion of Ukraine, there must have been about 12 European Union foreign ministers of various sorts coming through to Delhi to try and convince India to cut its ties with Russia, to criticize Russia. And India refused to do any of that, not even voting for any of the United Nations resolutions on the subject. Since then, India grew its imports of Russian oil. And if in February 2022, External Affairs Minister Jaishankar said we take less than 0.5% of our oil from Russia, by the end of 2023, we were already taking between 30 to 40% of Russian crude, which was cheap. It was not as good for our refineries, but it was coming at very, very discounted prices. So that has continued throughout, and I think India has made it clear that its own interests on getting affordable energy are much more important than it is going to, follow in the Western ideas of sanctions and all the rest of that. What is interesting is that the G7 has held these meetings every year and is going to tomorrow as well, again, reflect on some of the strictures they've passed against Russia. And India has consistently not been a part of that. And I think there is now an understanding in the European Union that India is not going to shift its position. More importantly, to watch will be tomorrow, because Ukraine President Zelensky is expected to be in Apulia in Italy, where the G7 is being held. And all eyes will be on whether there's a meeting between Prime Minister Modi and President Zelensky there. There's also still some hope that India will send a high-level delegation to the Swiss peace formula on Saturday and Sunday. So far, India has only confirmed that they will attend the conference, but not who they will send. The invitation had come for Prime Minister Modi. There had been a hope that at least External Affairs Minister could be sent. So far, the External Affairs Ministry has kept its cards close to its chest, saying essentially that they will send a delegation at the appropriate level. Officials behind the scenes say that suggests it will be an official rather than a political level delegation that goes to that. So those are all things to watch out for tomorrow.
Lots of items on the agenda and lots changing the entire move of this election to the European Parliament towards right-wing politics and the rise, as we are seeing it, though of course the centre has maintained its hold, but we'll have to see in times to come which are the factors. And like Suhasini put it right up front, issues like immigration, issues like protectionism are going to be coming into play. And besides, all the things that we are seeing connected with climate change, all of that is going to be in play. We will see how much of India's agenda gets pushed with bilateral meetings that take place. India attending the G7 summit this time in Italy. We will keep monitoring the situation. Mr. Nalapat, Suhasini Haidar, thank you very much for joining us with your perspective on this edition of India Tonight. Pleasure having you with us.
If you like this video, then like, share and subscribe to ET Now.